Welcome to Washington Today on C-SPAN Radio for Thursday, July 28th, 2022. Senator Joe Manchin, Democrat from West Virginia, explaining why he changed his mind about including climate and energy provisions in the large domestic spending and tax package that he and the Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer have unveiled. It's a bill that will be considered under rules that cannot be filibustered by Republicans. Senator Manchin says that what is in this final bill will not add to the country's high inflation. President Joe Biden speaking in favor of this package. It also includes portions on health care subsidies and corporate tax increases. Senate Republican leader Mitch McConnell says it will only make inflation worse. The Commerce Department report on the GDP, gross domestic product, out today, showing the U.S. economy shrank during the last 3 months, the second consecutive quarter in the red. And the debate continues over whether that indicates the U.S. is officially in a recession. President Biden saying no, Senator McConnell saying yes. The U.S. House passing the CHIPS Act, a bill to support domestic semiconductor computer chip industry. It also contains science research authorizations. The Senate passed the bill Wednesday, so now it goes to President Biden to be signed into law. Jon Stewart, comedian and activist, lashing out after a bill designed to help veterans exposed to toxic burn pit stalls in the Senate. And Chinese President Xi Jinping warning President Biden in a phone call. House Speaker Nancy Pelosi should not be traveling to Taiwan. There are reports that she is going to make that trip. China claims that's still Chinese territory. We'll hear from the White House and talk about this with a foreign policy reporter at The Hill. Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer, writes Associated Press, told fellow Senate Democrats on Thursday they now have an opportunity to achieve two largely important priorities on health care and climate change if they stick together and approve the deal he brokered with holdout Democratic Senator Joe Manchin. Schumer spoke at a private meeting after the startling turnaround over an expansive agreement he and Manchin struck that had eluded them for months. The Democratic leader's comments were relayed by a person familiar with the meeting as a Capitol complex granted anonymity to discuss it. The package includes provisions lowering the cost of prescription drugs, extending health insurance subsidies, investing in renewable energy, giving tax rebates for buying electric vehicles. The largest revenue raiser is a new 15% minimum tax on corporations earning more than $1 billion in profits. In all, $739 billion in new revenue, $433 billion in spending. And the difference between them, Democrats say, that's deficit reduction. They've also labeled it as an inflation-reducing bill. Senator Joe Manchin in isolation after a COVID-19 positive test on West Virginia Metro News Radio today with Hoppy Kercheval.
You on this program less than 2 weeks ago said that you wanted to wait before you did a deal. You wanted to wait until you saw what new economic numbers would be, particularly on inflation, because you were concerned about inflation. Have expressed that for months. Well, the new inflation numbers are not out yet. We still have the old number of 9.1%. The only significant new number we have is we had negative economic growth in the second quarter, so we're probably in a recession. So what changed? What specifically changed between the last time we talked to produce this deal? What changed?
Well, let me take you through the process then. When we were working and negotiating, our staff started way back in April. And first of all, nobody in their right mind, after I've been ostracized for how long and victimized, if you will, because I killed the BBB, because the BBB was just, I think, a bad bill for our economy. It was a bad bill for our country, and it changed the trajectory of who we are as people. So I was totally opposed to that, and everyone kept saying, Build Back Better smaller. There's no such thing as a Build Back Better. This is truly going to be around inflation reduction. So what we did, we started talking, started negotiating, and this and that and everything else. And the bill that we had, there were some things in that bill that we were negotiating up until when the 9.1% came out. There were some things in the bill that I was concerned about that could be looked to be inflationary, inflammatory. So I told Chuck Schumer on Thursday, I said, Chuck, I want to wait. I am not satisfied with the way some of the things we have. Then we better wait and see what this inflation figures are for the month of July, because everyone was saying it's going to go down, go down, go down. Well, I've been hearing that since it was 6%, then went to 8%, then went to 9.1. So I told my staff after, and Chuck got mad, and he said, well, you're walking away, you're not going to do this and that. And I said, Chuck, I'm not walking away from anything. I'm just being very cautious. The people in West Virginia can't afford higher prices. They can't afford higher gasoline prices.
So what
higher
changed?
Food prices,
What
higher
changed?
energy prices. So I told my staff to start scrubbing it. I said, scrub this bill down. There can't be one thing that you can say, oh, that caused inflation.
Senator Joe Manchin, Democrat from West Virginia, on West Virginia Metro News Radio. The program is a talk line with Hoppy Kercheval. He was referring to BBB, that stands for Build Back Better. That was the early name for the larger domestic spending and tax package that was being negotiated a couple of years ago before they ended up where they are now. President Joe Biden at the White House talking about the deal that Manchin and Senator Schumer reached and applauding it.
Yesterday, I spoke with both Senator Schumer and Manchin and offered my support for a historic agreement to fight inflation and lower costs for American families. It's called the Inflation Reduction Act of 2022. Some of you will see a lot of similarities between the beginning of the Build Back Better initiative. It's not all of it, but we've moved a long way. I'll be going into detail in a minute, but simply put, the bill will lower health care costs for millions of Americans. It will be the most important investment, not hyperbole, the most important investment we've ever made in our energy security and developing cost savings and job-creating clean energy solutions for the future. It's a big deal. Also, for the first time in a long time, began to restore fairness to the tax code, by making the largest corporations in America pay their fair share without any new taxes on people making under $400,000 a year. Experts, even some experts who have criticized my administration in the past, agree that this bill will reduce inflationary pressures on the economy. This bill will, in fact, reduce inflationary pressure on the economy. It's a bill that will cut your cost of living and reduce inflation and it lowers the deficit. It strengthens our economy in the long run as well. This bill has won the support of climate leaders like former Vice President Al Gore, who said the bill is, quote, long overdue and a necessary step to ensure the United States takes decisive action on the climate crisis that helps our economy and provides leadership for the world by example. Inflation hawks like former Secretary of Treasury Larry Summers said, quote, this bill is fighting inflation. Let me say, this bill is fighting inflation. Progressive leaders like Senator Elizabeth Warren said, quote, this is a bill that truly is about fighting inflation, bringing down the cost for families, and putting our country on a sounder economic footing.
President Biden at the White House. After his full remarks explaining the details of this proposal on health and climate and tax, just as reporters wanted to ask him questions, he said he needed to mention one other thing. The Commerce Department today reporting the economy contracted in the second quarter at a 0.9% annual rate. It's the GDP, gross domestic product. It's the second quarter in a row the U.S. economy has shrunk. The first quarter it was down 1.6%. Associated Press writing consecutive quarters of falling GDP constitute one informal, though not definitive, indicator of a recession. Here's President Biden.
Let me speak to one other issue, the GDP, and whether or not we are in a recession. Both Chairman Powell and many of the significant banking personnel and economists say we're not in a recession. But let me just give you what the facts are in terms of the state of the economy. Number one, we have a record job market of record unemployment of 3.6% today. We've created 9 million new jobs so far, just since I became president. Businesses are investing in America at record rates, Foreign business like SK and others are investing in America, hundreds of millions and trillions of dollars, sum total. $100 billion in semiconductor investments already announced by Intel, Samsung, and Texas Instruments. More than $100 billion in electric vehicle battery investments by Ford, General Motors, Hyundai, Tesla, and more. And just last week, as I said, SK Corporation of the Republic of Korea announced $22 billion in new investment in semiconductor batteries, chargers, and medical devices, creating another 16,000 jobs here in America. And this is powering the strongest rebound in American manufacturing in over 3 decades, creating 613,000 manufacturing jobs. Passing the CHIPS bill is going to put another $72 billion for incentives and tax credits to expand semiconductor production. And the Inflation Reduction Act will add another $370 billion in clean energy tax credits in reconciliation, including incentives to accelerate domestic production of solar panels, wind turbines, batteries, and critical materials processing. That doesn't sound like a recession to me.
President Joe Biden at the White House. By the way, after those comments, he did walk out without taking any reporters' questions. On the Senate floor today, the Minority Leader Mitch McConnell, Republican from Kentucky, says that the Commerce Department's GDP report today, negative economic growth, 2 straight quarters, does mean recession. Senator McConnell also speaking against that domestic spending and tax package announced by the Democrats.
Democrats' inflation is stealing more than $5,000 from the average family per year. And like a supermajority of Americans already knew before this morning, it has now driven the country into a recession. A few years back, our colleague, the senior senator for West Virginia, said, quote, "I don't think that during a time of recession you mess with any of the taxes or increase any taxes." But alas, yesterday, Washington Democrats announced they plan to do exactly that. The Democrats who robbed American families once with inflation now want to rob the country a second time through a gigantic job-killing tax hike. Apparently, our Democratic colleagues do not want to be responsible for just skyrocketing prices alone. They want Americans to be faced with skyrocketing prices and higher taxes and fewer jobs, all at the same time. Democrats have outlined a giant package of huge, new, job-killing tax hikes. Green New Deal craziness that will kill American energy, and prescription drug socialism that will leave us with fewer life-saving medicines. A reckless taxing and spending spree that will delight the far left and hammer working families even harder. Democrats are going all in on a multi-hundred billion dollar tax hike on American jobs that experts called the single, listen to this, the single most economically damaging part of their entire BBB plan from last year. Years of research show the burden would be overwhelmingly passed down to workers. This one tax hike alone would kill tens of thousands of American jobs. Democrats aren't sticking it to the fat cats. They're sticking it to the same middle-class families they've already crushed with inflation. So Democrats want to respond to their inflation crisis by killing jobs. They also want to respond to a global energy crisis by attacking American natural gas. This reckless taxing and spending spree includes a massive new tax on American natural gas, our country's single largest source of electricity. We all know when you tax something, you get less of it.
The Senate Republican leader, Minority Leader Mitch McConnell, on the Senate floor. Majority Leader Chuck Schumer in the Senate says the Senate will be voting on this budget reconciliation package next week. And House Speaker Nancy Pelosi, Democrat from California, tweeting her support. So if it passes the Senate, she plans to bring it up in the House as well. Senate Republicans cannot filibuster this bill. It's brought up under the budget reconciliation process. But Senate Democrats will need to have every one of their 50 caucus members voting yes if all 50 Republicans vote no in the Senate. And that will allow the Democratic Vice President Kamala Harris, who's president of the Senate, to break the tie in the Democrats' favor. Senator Joe Manchin, who was a holdout Democrat, as we talked about, now on board. But CNN reporter Manu Raju tweeting, there's still a question on whether Senator Kyrsten Sinema, Democrat from Arizona, will get behind the Manchin-Schumer deal, and her office says she is still not commenting. A spokesperson quoted as saying she doesn't have comment. She'll need to review the text and what comes out of the parliamentarian process. Manu Raju also tweeting a quote from Senator Joe Manchin about Senator Sinema. Manchin holding a teleconference today. I've not spoken to her about this, he says. I would hope that she would be receptive. Wall Street today, the Dow up 332, NASDAQ up 130, S&P up 48. U.S. House passing a bill that would increase U.S. computer chip manufacturing support and fund scientific research. A day after the bill passed the Senate vote was a bipartisan vote. The House vote was sort of a bipartisan vote today. House vote 243 to 187, with 24 Republicans joining the Democrats in voting yes. There was one present vote. Sarah Jacobs, Democrat of California, voting present. After Senate Democrats announced the budget reconciliation deal on climate, health, and taxes, House Republicans urging their members to vote no on this CHIPS and Science bill. The House Minority Whip Steve Scalise writing a memo saying the Democrats are, quote, pairing up a tone-deaf agenda that on one hand gives billions away in corporate handouts and on the other hand undoes historic tax cuts implemented by Republicans. As mentioned, the CHIPS and Science bill did pass. Here's some of the debate before that vote. We start with Congresswoman Eddie Bernice Johnson, Democrat from Texas, chair of the Science, Space, and Technology Committee.
With this legislation, we will bring about solutions for the climate crisis, enhance our semiconductor research and manufacturing, create jobs, increase regional innovation, and so much more. We will also take historic and much-needed action to build a strong and diverse STEM workforce and ensure that we're able to make use of all the brain power and talent we have in our great nation. With bipartisan STEM pieces in this bill, we will create a bright future for all of those who wish to pursue STEM, no matter their race, gender, or zip code. We are ushering in a strong future for our premier scientific agencies with transformational funding at NIST, NSF, and DOE. We also authorize important activities at NASA and address other discrete research topics across the government's scientific agencies.
Congresswoman Eddie Bernice Johnson, Democrat from Texas, chair of the Science, Space, and Technology Committee, supporting this bill. The ranking Republican on the committee, Frank Lucas of Oklahoma, opposing.
For better or for worse, it's very clearly for the worse, I would note. The CHIPS and Science Act has been irrevocably tied to a massive tax hike and spending spree in reconciliation. The decisions on how to pursue scientific policy are out of the hands of this committee, and at this point, particularly, out of the hands of this chamber. Mr. Speaker, I remain incredibly proud of the good work we've done to strategically strengthen American research and development. And yet, I cannot ignore the fact that the immense tax hikes and irresponsible spending in the expanded reconciliation package changed the calculus when it comes to supporting spending bills, particularly a bill that has come to be tied to reconciliation. This is one of those occasions that, as a statesman and responsible member of Congress, I have to put aside my own pride in the Science Committee's work and cast a vote that represents the best interest of Americans, and particularly the good people of the 3rd District of Oklahoma. So regrettably, and it's more regrettably than you can possibly imagine, I will not be casting my vote for CHIPS and Science Act today.
Congressman Frank Lucas on the House floor. Again, this bill did pass with 24 Republicans joining the Democrats in voting yes. The Senate had already passed it this week, so now it heads to President Biden's desk where he will sign it into law. $280 billion to strengthen domestic computer chip manufacturing and finance scientific research, all in an effort to increase the United States' competitiveness with China and other nations. An article at CNN, House Speaker Nancy Pelosi, Senate Democrats, and comedian and activist Jon Stewart railed against Senate Republicans who voted against legislation to help veterans suffering from ailments related to toxic burn pits, calling it a gut punch to the veterans who had come to Capitol Hill to celebrate the legislation. We'll hear from those Democrats and Jon Stewart in just a moment. But first, Republican Senator Pat Toomey of Pennsylvania explained on the Senate floor on Wednesday why he and enough other Senate Republicans voted no on a procedural vote to block the bill. He says a provision in the bill would reclassify almost $400 billion in VA spending from discretionary to mandatory accounts, and that would free up more budget authority to increase discretionary spending in other areas.
My concern about this bill has nothing to do with the purpose of the bill. It's not about the approximately $280 billion of new spending that is meant to be required under this bill for the VA to cover Medicare and other health care, I should say, and other benefits for veterans who are exposed to toxic burn pits. What I want to change has absolutely nothing to do with any of that. I see the chairman of the Committee of Jurisdiction. I think he understands that I have no interest in modifying the purpose of this bill, all the work that he and many others have done. And by the way, I suspect there's 85 votes for this bill, for the underlying bill, if we fix this problem. And here's the problem. Completely unrelated to the $280 billion of new spending, there is a mechanism created in this bill. It's a budgetary gimmick that has the intent of making it possible to have a huge explosion in unrelated spending, $400 billion. This budgetary gimmick is so unrelated to the actual veterans issue that has to do with burn pits that it's not even in the House version of this bill. So the fact is, we can fix this tonight. This is relatively easy fix. There might be a few technical things we'd iron out, and we could get this done tonight. And I know the chairman of the committee very much wants to get this bill done. This is the path to do it.
Senator Pat Toomey on the Senate floor Wednesday. That was after the Senate voted against proceeding forward with this veterans health care bill towards final passage. The vote was 55-42. Got a majority, but didn't get the 60 votes needed to advance it. Today, at a news conference outside the U.S. Capitol, Senator Jon Tester, Democrat from Montana, chair of the Veterans Affairs Committee, responding to Senator Toomey.
Senator Toomey brought up this thing that he calls a gimmick, which, by the way, is what the Appropriations Committee is supposed to do when issues come up on veterans. The Appropriations Committee should be able to address those issues. He wants to stop that from happening. And while we have, and I'm going to say Republicans because they're the ones that flip, Republicans say, you know what, I don't have a problem with the cost of this bill, but I'm going to vote no because of some other reason whatsoever. That is political malpractice, and we need to hold people accountable. I'm going to tell you something. I've been in this business for 25 years between the state legislature and here, and I have never seen anything that's happened like happened yesterday. And what compounds it and what makes it that much more difficult is we, in essence, yesterday took benefits away from the people who have been impacted by war, that we sent off to war, and we turn our backs and say no. We're going to find an excuse to vote against our veterans while we wave the flag, talking about how great our fighting men and women are.
Senator Jon Tester chairs the Veterans Affairs Committee, part of a news conference outside the U.S. Capitol building today, joined by other Senate and House Democrats and activists, including comedian Jon Stewart.
Pat Toomey stood up there, Patriot Pat Toomey, excuse me, I'm sorry. I want to give him his propers. I want to make sure that I give him his propers. Patriot Pat Toomey stood on the floor and said, this is a slush fund. They're going to use $400 billion to spend on whatever they want. That's nonsense. I call bullshit. This isn't a slush fund. You know what's a slush fund? The OCO, the Overseas Contingency Operations Fund, $60 billion, $70 billion every year on top of $500 billion, $600 billion, $700 billion of a defense budget. That's a slush fund, unaccountable, no guardrails. Did Pat Toomey stand up and say, this is irresponsible, the guardrails? No. Not one of them did. They vote for it year after year after year. You don't support the troops. You support the war machine.
Jon Stewart at a news conference today. The Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer says that the Senate will take another vote on whether to advance this veterans health care bill on Monday. Washington Post writes the bill would significantly change how the Department of Veterans Affairs cares for veterans who were exposed to toxic substances by compelling the VA to presume that certain illnesses are linked to exposure to hazardous waste incineration. Almost 800,000 more monkeypox vaccine doses will soon be available in the U.S. Health and Human Services Secretary Javier Becerra says the doses imported from a manufacturer in Denmark, which has now been cleared by the FDA to do that, will be distributed to state and local jurisdictions. Secretary Becerra on a teleconference today also asked about funding to respond to this outbreak in the U.S. and reports the Biden administration may declare monkeypox a public health emergency. Question coming from New York Times reporter Cheryl Stolberg.
As you know, Senate Democrats just dropped $21 billion for emergency COVID funding, and I'm wondering if you're expecting that some of that will go towards monkeypox. And then second, it appears clear that you're weighing a public health emergency, and you've got a lot of requests for public health emergencies for gun violence and reproductive rights, et cetera. I'm wondering if you can just talk about the considerations and how you're weighing, your thinking on whether or not monkeypox should be a public health emergency.
Sure. The first question, Cheryl, we have communicated to Congress what we believe would be a good path forward on monkeypox, what it would take in terms of resources, and authorities to be able to move forward and, as I've said, stay ahead of monkeypox and to end this outbreak. We have shared with Congress as well what it takes to continue the fight on COVID. We hope that Congress will act on both. And so we'll see. We will continue to provide whatever information and technical assistance they request of us so they can try to pull together a plan both for COVID and for monkeypox. In terms of the public health emergency and how it weighs relative to other issues, we're going to take each one as they come before us and engage based on the criteria for calling a public health emergency. In this particular case of monkeypox, what I can tell you is we continue to monitor the response throughout the country on monkeypox. As I've said, we've made vaccines, tests, and treatments well beyond the numbers that are currently needed, available to all jurisdictions who manage their public health systems and are the ones that work with clinicians to make all three, the tests, the treatments, and the vaccines available. And we will weigh any decision on declaring a public health emergency based on the response we're seeing throughout the country. And bottom line is we need to stay ahead of this and be able to end this outbreak.
Health and Human Services Secretary Javier Becerra on a teleconference with reporters. The CDC reporting over 4,600 confirmed monkeypox cases in the United States. Washington Today continues in a moment.
The weekly podcast is a unique offering from C-SPAN. We tape it right here in the C-SPAN studios in beautiful downtown Capitol Hill. In a town where extremes get all the attention, this isn't more extreme opinion, it's extreme history. From what's new and happening right now, relive the history you know. So listen, follow, and enjoy the C-SPAN podcast, The Weekly. Find it wherever you get podcasts.
Welcome back to Washington Today, available as a podcast on the free C-SPAN Now mobile video app and wherever you get your podcasts. China's foreign ministry has a readout of a telephone call between President Xi Jinping and President Joe Biden today. It includes a warning about House Speaker Nancy Pelosi's reported upcoming trip to Taiwan, the self-governing island that China considers part of China. The Chinese ministry saying that President Xi told President Biden about the historical ins and outs of the Taiwan question, saying they're crystal clear, and so are the fact and the status quo that both sides of the Taiwan Strait belong to one and the same China. Xi Jinping also saying those who play with fire will only get burnt. We hope the U.S. side can see this clearly. About the President Biden's perspective on that telephone call, here are questions to the White House Press Secretary Karine Jean-Pierre.
First on the Xi call, Beijing said in its readout of the call that President Xi told President Biden that, quote, those who play with fire will perish by it. So does the White House consider that as an escalation by China?
I'm not going to speak to that statement, that comment that you just read out. But let me give you a little bit of what was discussed and a little bit of the call, some specifics. So the president was joined by National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan, Secretary of State Blinken, Principal Deputy National Security Advisor John Feiner, Kurt Campbell, and Laura Rosenberger. The two leaders spoke for 2 hours and 20 minutes. This call has been in the works for quite some time. National Security Advisor Sullivan proposed this call in June during his meeting with his PRC counterpart as part of our efforts to maintain open lines of communication and management the relationship responsibly. I'll say this, they had a very direct conversation and that they've known each other for some time. President Biden has known President Xi for about 4 decades. This is a relationship that they've had for some time, and again, it was a direct, straightforward conversation. This is something you hear from the president all the time, and the importance of having leader-to-leader conversation. But again, I'm not going to speak to or characterize what was just stated.
More on House Speaker Nancy Pelosi's possible trip to Taiwan. We're joined by Laura Kelly, foreign policy reporter with The Hill. Thank you for being with us. Every time there's been a news conference this week, with members of Congress, they've all been asked about this trip. What's been the reaction from Republicans and Democrats on Capitol Hill?
It's been a pretty interesting and some surprising reactions that Republicans, those who are on polar opposite sides of nearly every issue with Speaker Pelosi, are really coming out and cheering her on if she goes through with this trip to Taiwan. Lawmakers are really viewing this as democracy standing up to autocracies and not letting the Chinese Communist Party dictate where U.S. lawmakers can go in the world, and especially to places where we have an interest for our own national security. And not only is it a standing up to the Chinese Communist Party, but also viewed as standing up to Russia and really making that stand on the global stage.
Some reports as well that other members of Congress may be going with her.
So Speaker Pelosi's office and the White House and the State Department and the Department of Defense have not confirmed the Speaker's travel at all. But Congressman Michael McCaul, who's the ranking member of the House Foreign Affairs Committee, told an NBC reporter that he was disappointed that he wouldn't be able to go. So therefore, de facto confirming the trip, and then his office came out with a statement kind of backing up to the congressman's words. But Speaker Pelosi's travel is still not confirmed, and Bloomberg is reporting today that she may also go to Singapore, Japan, and Indonesia, and those could potentially give her cover to not go to Taiwan, but just adding more to what she could do in the region.
Is there any way to tell why Speaker Pelosi might be taking this trip now?
One is that lawmakers go on August recess, and they tend to travel during that time. But the reason that this is such a provocation at this moment is because her trip will come just ahead of the 95th anniversary of the People's Liberation Army, and also it comes ahead of the 20th Chinese Communist Party Congress, where they are expected to elect Chinese President Xi Jinping for his third 5-year term as president, while also laying out their major policy priorities for the next few years. So Speaker Pelosi landing in Taiwan and showing great U.S. commitment to Taiwan's democratic government is really seen as an affront to Beijing's claims on the island, and they have spoken out very vehemently against her visiting Taiwan.
We're talking with Laura Kelly from The Hill. China's readout of President Joe Biden and President Xi Jinping's phone call today has President Xi talking about playing with fire. What are the risks of Speaker Pelosi going to Taiwan?
Well, we see some pretty scary military risks and physical risks. Some of the things that have been floated are that the Chinese could carry out military flyovers in Taiwan's airspace, which they tend to do from time to time in areas that are somewhat considered international, but around the speaker's visit could be very provocative. They could go a step further and fly planes over Taiwan, and even worse, they could try and interfere with Speaker Pelosi's plane landing on Taiwan at all. So there are some reports that the Pentagon is developing security plans to protect the speaker if she goes, but these things are pretty scary.
Laura Kelly is a foreign policy reporter for The Hill. Her story's at thehill.com and on Twitter at @HelloLauraKelly. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
House Speaker Nancy Pelosi is holding a news conference on Friday. C-SPAN will cover that, and we may get reporters' questions more about this possible trip. This is Washington Today. From Al Jazeera, the family of Shireen Abu Akleh has called on the United States to investigate the killing of the Al Jazeera journalist who was fatally shot by Israeli forces in May, renewing calls for answers and accountability in the case. At a news conference outside the U.S. Capitol on Thursday, Abu Akleh's relatives, joined by several U.S. lawmakers, emphasized that the slain journalist was a U.S. citizen entitled to the protection of her government. That reported from Al Jazeera. One of those lawmakers at the news conference on Capitol Hill, Congresswoman Rashida Tlaib, a Democrat from Michigan.
When Americans are killed abroad, it is more or less standard procedure for our government to open an investigation. But when the murderers wear Israeli uniforms, there's complete silence. Poor Rachel Corrie's family to this day has been waiting for justice since 2003, and still nothing. Shireen wasn't even only an American murdered by apartheid state of Israel, but she was also part of the journalist community. That's why I'm proud to demand that Biden administration direct the Department of Justice, including the Human Rights and Special Prosecutions section, and the FBI and other relevant U.S. offices or agencies to launch a thorough, credible, independent, and transparent investigation into Shireen, Ahmad, and Rachel's murders. It is also clear that the State Department has comprehensively failed to live up to its mission to protect Americans abroad when they are murdered in the hands of Israel.
Congresswoman Rashida Tlaib, a Democrat from Michigan, also a Palestinian American herself, at a news conference on Capitol Hill with family of Shireen Abu Akleh. Tlaib referring to two other Americans killed in Israel, peace activist Rachel Corrie and 78-year-old Omar Assad, who apparently had a heart attack, according to reports, while in custody of the U.S. military. Family members of Shireen Abu Akleh meeting with Secretary of State Antony Blinken in Washington earlier this week, and today State Department spokesman Ned Price asked for an update by reporters.
On July 4th, earlier this month, the State Department published a statement that summarized the findings of the U.S. Security Coordinator. That work on the part of the U.S. Security Coordinator was itself a summation of the investigations that Palestinians and Israelis at that time had undertaken. Our focus has been on bridging those investigations. We continue to believe that by bridging those investigations, as we've been able to do, at least to some extent, that it will most effectively allow this process to culminate in accountability. And that's what's important to us, that this culminates in accountability. When the Secretary met with the family of Shireen Abu Akleh earlier this week, not only did he express his heartfelt condolences to the family, but he made very clear the priority we attach to seeing accountability for her death. In this case, to seeing to it that steps are taken to put in place protections so that something like this can't happen again, or at least additional safeguards to protect against something like this from happening again.
State Department spokesman Ned Price today in the State Department briefing room with reporters. That statement from earlier this month he referred to concluded that Israel was likely responsible for the shooting death of Shireen Abu Akleh, but the physical evidence was too badly damaged to prove conclusive. A story from Fox News, the U.S. Justice Department investigating a cyber breach involving the federal court records management system. The department's top national security attorney told lawmakers on Thursday. Matt Olsen, head of the Justice Department's National Security Division, alluded to the threat of cyber attacks by foreign nations as he informed the U.S. House Judiciary Committee about the investigation into an effort to compromise public judicial dockets. That from Fox News. The C-SPAN covered this House Judiciary Committee hearing. The question came from the chair, Democrat Jerrold Nadler.
On January 6, 2021, the Administrative Office of the Courts released a public statement about a cybersecurity breach dating back to early 2020, unrelated to SolarWinds. However, it was only in March of this year that the committee first learned the startling breadth and scope of the court's document management system security failure. And perhaps even more concerning is the disturbing impact this security breach had on pending civil and criminal litigation, as well as on ongoing national security or intelligence matters. Understanding that this is an unclassified setting, what types of cases or investigations or U.S. attorneys' offices were impacted the most by this breach, and how many of those cases and investigations are within your division?
Chairman, let me begin by just saying that the threat we face from cyber-enabled attacks, whether that's to the government and the public sector, including Congress, and to the private sector, is one of the most significant threats we face as a country to our national security. For the National Security Division, we are focused on nation-state attacks. And those attacks can come from countries like China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea. While I can't speak directly to the nature of the ongoing investigation of the types of threats that you've mentioned regarding the effort to compromise the public judicial dockets, this is, of course, a significant concern for us, given the nature of the information that is often held by the courts.
Have any cases or investigations within the NSD been materially impacted, prolonged, or dismissed because of the court's breach?
I can't think of anything in particular that's been affected in the way that you describe, although I would want to double check on that. We are very concerned, and we're working, I can assure you, based on my own personal experience, that we're working very closely with the Judicial Conference and judges around the country to address this issue.
Matt Olsen is Assistant Attorney General for National Security, testifying before the House Judiciary Committee. Questions from the chair, Democrat Jerrold Nadler from New York. The topic of today's hearing was threats to national security. Several Republican members of that committee asking Matt Olsen about Hunter Biden, son of President Joe Biden. Here are the questions from Matt Gaetz, a Republican from Florida.
Is Hunter Biden a national security threat?
That's not a question that would come up before me, Congressman.
You're the head of the National Security Division, so it seems sort of on the nose.
It's not in my practice or experience to identify individuals
not in my purview.
and to
We've
label
heard that
any individual, an American citizen, or any individual as a national security threat.
Well, you would certainly concede that if the adult offspring of the President of the United States or the Vice President were compromised, that would be a national security threat, right?
We speak through our filings in court, and we speak through our actions in open court. So I would,
okay, well, speak to this. Where's the laptop?
Position.
Do you know where Hunter Biden's laptop is?
Again, I'm not going to talk about any potential ongoing investigation as I sit here.
Do you know where it is?
I'm not going to talk about any ongoing investigation.
You come here and you tell us you follow the facts and the law, but you can't even follow a laptop that you guys have had for 3 years.
We follow the facts and the law, and we speak in open court about our cases.
But you aren't speaking about this. But you know who is speaking about it? The whistleblowers from the FBI who've gone to Senator Grassley and said that you guys purposefully take any information that is derogatory about Hunter Biden and you go and rat hole it so that you never have to speak about it in any circumstance. But the good news is you're not the only ones with that laptop. So Patrick Ho was convicted of bribing government officials in Africa, and he gave $1 million to Hunter Biden. Are you familiar with that?
I'm not going to speak about any ongoing investigation.
Is that an ongoing?
I can assure
is
you
that an ongoing investigation?
I'm not going to.
Patrick
I'm
Ho
not going to
bribe?
speak about any potential ongoing
Don't
investigation.
you see that degrades the country's belief in you guys when you have whistleblowers saying that you're purposefully rat-holing this information, and then you come here and say you won't talk about it? I mean, inside Hunter Biden's multi-million-dollar deals with a Chinese energy company, Washington Post, Matt Vizier, Chinese elite paid $31 million to Hunter and the Bidens, Peter Schweitzer in the New York Post. Hunter Biden's business partner called Joe Biden the big guy in panic messages. Do you guys call Joe Biden the big guy at the Department of Justice?
So I think it's important to understand why we don't speak about cases outside of the courtroom.
By the way, I already know why.
If I may answer the question.
You know why you don't speak about it? Because it's about Hunter Biden. You guys have no problem leaking about other stuff, right? You got no problem going out and tagging parents at school board meetings as a national security threat. But when all of the facts and all of the law are before you regarding the corruption of Hunter Biden, you don't want to speak to that at all.
Congressman Matt Gaetz, Republican from Florida, questioning the Assistant Attorney General for National Security, Matt Olson, at today's House Judiciary Committee hearing. We've got the full hearing archived at our website at cspan.org. CBS News reported earlier this week that highly credible whistleblowers have come forward to a senior Senate Republican alleging a widespread effort within the FBI to downplay or discredit negative information about President Biden's son, Hunter Biden, according to letters reviewed by CBS. They quote the letters from Senator Chuck Grassley, Republican from Iowa, ranking member on the Senate Judiciary Committee, to the FBI Director Christopher Wray and Attorney General Merrick Garland, dated July 25th, that read, "The information provided to my office involves concerns about the FBI's receipt and use of derogatory information relating to Hunter Biden and the FBI's false portrayal of acquired evidence as disinformation. The volume and consistency of these allegations substantiate their credibility and necessitate this letter." Thanks for listening to Washington Today. Sign up for C-SPAN's evening newsletter word for word to get the latest Washington stories sent right to you at c-span.org/connect. Have a good night.